anything.
And so I'm living that dream, and it's wonderful.
Around him, and it's not that he was throwing fits and kicking over C-stands and throwing boxes.
Every day, I drop another story straight from the Golden Age. The scandals, the secrets, and the moments that shaped an unforgettable era. If you want to keep these memories alive with me, hit that subscribe button. It costs nothing, but it means everything. Thank you for being here. Now let's dive in. Ron Howard has always been the calm eye in Hollywood's wild storm, a filmmaker known for class, kindness, and staying out of drama. But when someone asked him about the darker truths of the industry that raised him, his whole expression changed. He once said quietly that people wouldn't believe what some legends became once the cameras turned off. The so-called Golden Age wasn't so golden after all. It was built on silence, pressure, and powerful people crushing whoever got in their way. Fame was a shield, and behind that shield, some stars did things that would ruin their images forever. The same faces who built America's fantasies were the ones breaking spirits behind closed doors. And now, after years of keeping it quiet, Ron Howard is finally ready to name the people tied to that chaos. Errol Flynn, the devil behind the smile. Long before smooth-talking spies or rum-drinking pirates, there was Flynn, the fearless adventurer who made danger look cool. On screen, he was magnetic, brave, sharp, and untouchable. Off-screen, Howard says, it was a whole different story. Reckless, impulsive, and ruled by ego. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn hit Hollywood like a storm in the 1930s and exploded into fame after Captain Blood in 1935. Studios made millions off Errol Flynn's charm, but behind that shine was a man drowning in chaos and addiction. By the early 1940s, his world was falling apart fast. In 1942, he was hit with charges tied to two young women, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen. The story exploded across headlines, splitting the nation right down the middle. Flynn laughed his way through the courtroom, acting like fame made him untouchable. Warner Brothers sent in their best lawyers, fans camped outside the courthouse screaming his name, and insiders whispered that some witnesses suddenly vanished after being pressured by people with serious power. He walked out acquitted, but the darkness around him only got heavier. Years later, in 1978, private letters surfaced showing him bragging about his past and mocking the people who said they were afraid of him. It was pure arrogance. Ron Howard said reading about that trial changed everything for him. That's when he realized Hollywood could protect the worst behavior just because someone smiled for the camera. To the public, Flynn was still the wild, charming rebel. But behind the scenes, he was a walking warning sign. Proof that talent and fame don't make you decent. Decades of alcohol, drugs, and chaos tore his life apart. And in 1959, at just 50 years old, Flynn collapsed in Vancouver after pushing his body to the edge. His autopsy listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and ulcers, but Howard said the real cause was clear. Flynn lived in extremes, always taking and never giving back. His story became a haunting symbol of Hollywood's moral collapse, a reminder that charm can mask cold hearts, and fame can't protect you forever. Then came Kirk Douglas, the man who couldn't stop fighting. To Ron Howard, Douglas was the ultimate contradiction. On screen, he stood for courage, justice, and loyalty. Off-screen, people described him as intense, intimidating, and always ready for a fight. Born Isur Danielovich in 1916 to a struggling immigrant family, Douglas clawed his way out of poverty with pure grit. By the time Spartacus made him a global icon, he had everything: power, money, respect. But behind that legend was a temper that could shake an entire room. Crew members said Kirk Douglas was nearly impossible to please, snapping without warning and leaving everyone on edge. Actress Deborah Paget once said he didn't just want to lead a scene, he wanted to own every person in it. Ron Howard, who studied Douglas's performances while learning the craft, later said there was a hidden rage under that smile, the kind that slowly eats a person from the inside out. That fiery attitude followed Douglas everywhere. Over the years, countless old Hollywood insiders whispered troubling stories about his behavior toward women. Some authors and people tied to the industry even revisited claims from the 1950s involving Natalie Wood, referencing her sister Lana's comments in a 2018 memoir. These stories have been debated for decades, and since many key people aren't alive to speak for themselves, Howard makes it clear these claims reflect the culture of that secretive, messy era, not confirmed facts. Douglas was never charged, and like so many others, the situation vanished behind Hollywood's infamous wall of silence, the same wall that protected powerful men for generations. Even long after his passing in 2020 at the age of 103, the conversation didn't return as tabloid gossip. It came back as professionals finally speaking truthfully about what really went on behind the cameras. On set, his presence could change the entire mood, one minute inspiring, the next freezing everyone in their tracks. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him twice, once said, "Douglas was the most driven man I've ever met, and the hardest to control." That says everything. Ron Howard later reflected that Douglas's real legacy wasn't just about skill or fame, it was a lesson in what happens when power goes unchecked. Douglas carried himself like the rules didn't apply to him, and the industry just let it slide. When he accepted his honorary Oscar in 1996, millions saw a proud man closing his life with grace. But Howard saw something else entirely. To him, it was the final act of someone who had spent decades outrunning his own inner chaos. Beneath all that applause, there was a truth Hollywood never liked to face, that some of its brightest legends built their careers not only on talent, but on fear, control, and dominance. Faye Dunaway, the queen of cruelty. If Errol Flynn stood for corruption and Kirk Douglas for explosive rage, then Dunaway was a whole different kind of storm. To Ron Howard, she proved that darkness in Hollywood didn't always show up through violence. Sometimes it came wrapped in ego, humiliation, and an icy kind of control that could freeze an entire set. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Dunaway shot to fame fast. Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, Chinatown in 1974, hit after hit, she looked untouchable, almost otherworldly, with that fierce, magnetic aura. But behind that glamorous glow, whispers followed her everywhere. Crew members talked about tantrums, wild demands, and how she treated assistants like they didn't even exist. Her Mommy Dearest co-star Rutanya Alda once said, "You could feel the fear on set, like everyone was waiting for an explosion." That film was supposed to show emotional abuse, but to many, it started to look like a mirror of Dunaway's own behavior. While playing Joan Crawford, a woman known for cruelty, Dunaway reportedly brought that same cold fire to life behind the scenes. Director Frank Perry later admitted he almost walked off the project because her outbursts were so intense. She threw objects, tore into makeup artists, and once, flat out, refused to film until the lighting made her look flawless. Ron Howard later used her as a warning, proof of what happens when an actor's need for control turns into full-blown domination. And it didn't stop there. On The Wicked Lady, stories said she slapped a cameraman, and during Don Juan DeMarco, crew members claimed she humiliated assistants so badly that production had to shut down for a day. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, once said, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." By the 2000s, the backlash finally caught up with her, and the legend of Faye Dunaway's icy power became just as famous as her films. Hollywood eventually turned its back on Faye Dunaway. Directors stopped calling, saying she was simply too hard to handle. In 2011, after being removed from a Broadway production of Tea at 5, Dunaway blamed everyone but herself. When a journalist later asked Ron Howard about her legacy, he didn't sugarcoat it. "She chased perfection so hard that she forgot compassion," he said. Her fall didn't happen overnight. It dragged on for years. The same woman who once ruled Hollywood ended up isolated, avoided, even at ceremonies celebrating her own classics. To Howard, she became a living warning, proof that when talent loses empathy, greatness turns toxic. He once said, "People talk about power in Hollywood, but power without grace turns to poison." Then came John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. Few Hollywood icons ever stood taller than him. To millions, he was America, the fearless cowboy, the loyal soldier, the man who never broke. But to Ron Howard, who grew up watching those old black and white classics, the truth behind that image had a darker side. Howard once admitted that when he found out who John Wayne really was, the hero image snapped instantly. He said, "I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully who wore his country like a costume." That realization hit him like a punch. Born Marion Morrison in Iowa in 1907, Wayne climbed the Hollywood ladder by selling a fantasy, the idea of unbeatable toughness. By the 1950s, he wasn't just an actor anymore. He was promoting a whole worldview. To him, disagreement was weakness and progress was betrayal. On set, he ruled through fear, not respect. Crew members said technicians who slipped up got humiliated in front of everyone. Actor Christopher Mitchum once said, "When Duke was angry, the air froze. You were either with Wayne or you were gone. There was no middle ground." Howard later reflected that this wasn't art, it was fear disguised as discipline. Wayne's temper didn't stop at shouting either. He was known to belittle women, mock indigenous performers on Western sets, and shut down black actors who tried to challenge the tired stereotypes Hollywood kept recycling. The man who stood as America's symbol of strength was, in reality, a reminder of how power can rot behind the camera. John Wayne's 1971 Playboy interview still shocks people to this day. In it, he made outrageous claims about indigenous land rights and said things about black Americans that revealed deep prejudice, all while bragging that movies needed real men, not whiners. Those comments resurfaced years later and shattered the image of the patriotic hero people once worshipped. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne went head-to-head with director John Ford over how to portray Ethan Edwards, a character fueled by hate and vengeance. Ford wanted the film to show that ugliness honestly, but Wayne pushed back hard. In the end, the character's cruelty came through, and so did Wayne's own coldness. Ron Howard, who studied the film years later while at USC, said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." Even near the end of his life, when cancer had weakened him, Wayne refused to back down from his old beliefs. He brushed off criticism, blamed changing times, and clung to that same harsh worldview until his death in 1979 at age 72. Many still praised him as an icon, but filmmakers like Howard saw something else entirely. To him, Wayne's story was a warning, proof that when power grows out of prejudice, it doesn't turn wise with age, it turns bitter. Howard once said, "The myth survived, but the man behind it never deserved the legend." Then came Roman Polanski, the exile of shame. To Ron Howard, Polanski's name represented one of Hollywood's hardest truths, that brilliance can exist right next to evil. He once said it was painful, realizing how much darkness hid behind the man's genius. "I admired his films before I knew who he really was," Howard admitted. "Then I realized talent doesn't absolve a person. Sometimes it hides them." Polanski's rise looked unstoppable. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents, he survived the horrors of World War II long before Hollywood even knew his name. Early films like Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby made him a critical darling, a director who could turn fear into art, suspense into poetry, and dread into something unforgettable. But as Ron Howard later said, the darkness in Roman Polanski's movies wasn't just great storytelling, it was a reflection of a man hiding storms behind the camera. In 1977, everything came crashing down. Polanski was arrested after an incident involving a young teenager, following what began as a photo session. The evidence was so strong that he pled guilty to a serious charge of unlawful conduct with a minor, a shocking admission that rocked Hollywood to its core. But before sentencing could happen, Polanski fled the US and escaped to France, where he refused to return. Hollywood split right down the middle. Some people condemned him completely, while others defended him, calling him a tortured artist. That divide still burns today. For Ron Howard, who was a young filmmaker watching it all unfold, the reaction was heartbreaking. "They spoke of art while a child's life was broken," he said years later, disgusted by how the industry twisted itself into knots to protect one of its own. Instead of choosing accountability, Polanski's self-imposed exile became one of the darkest stains in Hollywood's history. The case never disappeared, it just kept growing like a wound that wouldn't heal. His escape became a symbol of how the industry refused, again and again, to confront the crimes of powerful men. Yet somehow, Polanski kept making films overseas, and even won an Oscar in 2003 for The Pianist. Ron Howard called that moment surreal and stomach-turning. When the crowd at the Dolby Theater rose to give Polanski a standing ovation, Howard said he couldn't move. "I thought of that girl, alone at 13, and wondered how applause must sound to her ears," he said, frozen in disbelief. Even decades later, Hollywood's willingness to separate genius from accountability filled him with anger. When Polanski won France's César Award in 2020, protesters stormed out of the ceremony. And to Howard, that scene finally felt like justice, showing up late but not too late. In his 2021 Vanity Fair interview, Howard didn't hold back. "It took the world 40 years to say what should have been said the next day, that a monster doesn't become less monstrous just because he can frame a shot." Today, Polanski still lives freely in Europe, shielded by legal barriers, but haunted by the legacy he created. For Ron Howard, Polanski's story represents everything that poisoned the so-called Golden Age, a place where brilliance and cruelty walked hand in hand, and too many people chose silence over truth. A system that protected the artist but ignored everyone they hurt. That's what Ron Howard said defined old Hollywood. "Hollywood forgives anything," he once said bitterly, "as long as the lighting is good." If Roman Polanski exposed Hollywood's hypocrisy, then Mickey Rooney revealed its illusion. the idea that a big smile could hide a mountain of pain. To Ron Howard, who grew up watching Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, discovering who the man really was felt like a punch to the gut. "He was the face of joy," Howard once said, "but behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it." Born Joseph Ewell Jr. in 1920, Rooney became one of Hollywood's first massive child superstars. By 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America. MGM built their empire around that grin, that energy, that unstoppable spark. But that kind of fame messes with a person, and as Rooney got older, the chaos only grew louder. He married 8 times, cheated constantly, gambled away fortunes, and left heartbreak in every direction. His ex-wife Ava Gardner once said, "He was the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world." Behind closed doors, the charm vanished, and the trouble began. By 2011, accusations hit the headlines. His 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and her son were accused of isolating Rooney and taking control of his finances. But even long before that, stories about Rooney's temper and cruelty were already legendary. Former co-workers said he was unpredictable, sharp-tongued, and could tear into people without warning. What the world saw as innocent laughter, those bright eyes and that playful grin, was, according to Ron Howard, the mask of a man who'd been broken by fame and learned to break others too. Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney's closest friend during their MGM years, once said privately that he could make you laugh 1 minute and crush your spirit the next. Garland, who was pushed to the edge by studio pressure and her own emotional battles, later hinted that Rooney, not just the executives, shared some of the blame for the pain she endured in those early years. By the 1960s, Rooney's career was crumbling fast. Scandals, addiction, and financial ruin followed him like a shadow. In a 1979 interview, Rooney said, "I've lived 1,000 lives." But as Ron Howard later reflected, he lived them all for himself. Even in his later years, Rooney's anger never faded. He blamed everyone: studios, friends, partners, even fate itself, for the collapse of his once glorious life. When he passed in 2014 at 93, the man who once ruled Hollywood died with less than $20,000 to his name. His body even went unclaimed at first, until friends raised enough for a modest burial in Los Angeles. For Ron Howard, Rooney's story wasn't just a sad ending. It was the final piece of a disturbing pattern, proof that behind Hollywood's brightest smiles often hid the darkest secrets. "He made the world laugh while he was dying inside," Howard said, calling it the saddest kind of evil, when someone's pain becomes their performance and no one notices until it's too late. To Howard, these stories were never about revenge. They were warnings. The so-called golden age wasn't golden at all. It was built on silence, pressure, and lives destroyed behind the glittering curtain of fame. And as Howard once said, the scariest monsters aren't in horror films. They're the ones the spotlight protects. What do you think? Would you still call it Hollywood's golden age? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if you felt something real. Share this with someone who loves classic films, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking stories. See you in the next video.